All right, so for the notes tonight, we're going to take a look at Boston as the center of protest in a lot of ways for the colonists. We've talked about how the French and Indian War led to the need for Britain to make money, to repay their debts, and they tried taxing the colonists. The Stamp Act was an important attempt. Colonists weren't happy with it, and so Britain decides to end up repealing it, only to replace it with more taxes. And so we're going to take a look today at what happens sort of next in the story. And we're going to start with the Boston Massacre. This is an important engraving of the massacre that we're going to take a closer look at in class. So, a little bit of background. After repealing the Stamp Act, Britain passed new taxes. We've already talked about that in class. Those were called the Townshend Acts. And British officials cracked down on smuggling. So they not only passed new taxes, but then they were enforcing them more to make sure that the taxes were being paid. England sent more soldiers over and more royal officials to the colonies as well. So they really start cracking down. They repeal the Stamp Act, but in some ways make things worse with these new taxes and sending over soldiers and other officials. The situation in Boston was especially bad. The soldiers that came over were competing with citizens for jobs. And the soldiers and the citizens both behaved pretty badly towards one another. They taunted each other. They did things like hold band practice for the soldiers during the middle of a church service, calling each other names, throwing things at each other. Really, sort of petulant and childish behavior between the two groups. Things come to a head one night in March of 1770 when a sort of unruly crowd and a group of British soldiers confront each other. The crowd taunted the soldiers. They threw things at the soldiers, like snowballs stuffed with rocks inside. They weren't this peaceful crowd. The soldiers end up firing on the crowd, and 5 people were killed. We're still not sure, whether they were told to fire or whether somebody just fired accidentally, but we know that the soldiers opened fire, 5 people were killed. The Sons of Liberty, the patriot group based out of Boston, dubbed it the Boston Massacre. So there's one example of tensions really rising in Boston. The next major topic in Boston was the Boston Tea Party. And of course, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the idea of the colonists dressing up as natives, going out and dumping the tea into the harbor. This picture is very misleading, and again, we'll take a closer look at it in class. But what we think happened and what really happened oftentimes are a little bit different. So let's take a look at what actually happened. In 1770, Parliament canceled all taxes on the colonies, except the tax on tea. So once again, Parliament gets rid of the taxes that are there, but just to show that they do have the power to tax the colonies, they left the tax on tea in place. They gave a company called the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales to the colonies. So they were the only company allowed to sell tea to the colonies. And the East India Company had way too much tea. They're in financial trouble. They really needed to get rid of some of the tea, make some money. But remember, colonists didn't want to pay the taxes, so they're not buying the tea. So the company comes up with a clever plan to try to pass the tax on and get the colonists to buy more tea. To get the colonists to pay the tax, the company decided what it would do is it would have its agents pay the tax ahead of time and then pass the cost on to the buyers. That way the colonists would be footing the bill for the tax without even realizing it. Fairly clever plan, right? But not smart enough for the Sons of Liberty. They realized what was happening, and they organized what they called a Tea Party. One night in late 1773, a group of men from the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Indians, boarded the tea ships in Boston Harbor. So the ships had just been sitting there, right? The colonists wouldn't let them unload the ships. They didn't want to pay the tax. So the Sons of Liberty take it upon themselves. They row out, they destroy 35,000 pounds of tea. As you can imagine, the people in charge of the company were pretty furious. They expected the British government to protect their property. They just lost a lot of money. And to boot, there were a lot of really powerful people who owned stock in the company, including King George. So the colonists didn't just destroy the tea, they were making a strong political statement. And it angered a lot of people in Britain. Which leads to the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts are Britain's response to the Boston Tea Party. Parliament passed these laws to punish Boston, right? And they applied really only to Boston and the surrounding Massachusetts area, and they were going to stay in effect until Boston paid back the cost of the tea that was destroyed. So, what did the Intolerable Acts do? Well, for one, the British Army was put in charge of the city. So they sent over more troops, and the soldiers, who already people in Boston didn't want the soldiers to be there, the soldiers were then put in charge of the city. The royal governor was given almost total control of the government. This is a guy handpicked by the king, and so he was allowed to appoint officials however he wanted, and he was allowed to ban town meetings from happening. British officials who were accused of crimes in America would be sent to England for trial. And this was an important change because colonists felt like, well, soldiers or other British officials are now just going to be allowed to do whatever they want and get away with it. Because if they get sent back to England, they're going to get off the hook. And perhaps most harshly, you might argue, Boston's harbor was shut down. And you can see from the map here of Boston in 1773, it's surrounded by water. So if you shut down that harbor, nothing comes into the city, nothing goes out of the city. This is going to hurt businesses, might even lead to starvation. And so in response to the Intolerable Acts, Boston sends out a plea. They ask the colonies for help. And so this famous cartoon here, which is actually created a little bit earlier, it wasn't created because of the Intolerable Acts, but it's appropriate, gives that idea of the colonies are really starting to understand they've got to band together. They're going to have to band together or they'll die separately.